At the end of the late 1980s, Nintendo was on top of the world. The NES held ultimate sway over the American video game market, and Nintendo's closest rivals were struggling to release consoles that could compete with their company. As the decade came to a close, a new generation of home consoles began making headway in the industry, as developers shifted from 8-bit hardware to the more powerful 16-bit hardware of systems like the Genesis and TurboGrafx-16. At Nintendo, work on a new entry in the Legend of Zelda series was already underway, as a small team worked around the clock to craft the next entry in Nintendo's biggest adventure series on the NES. The story of The Legend of Zelda continues with the 16-bit entry in the series, A Link to the Past. In 1988, the developers at Nintendo's Research and Development 4 team were wrapping up work on some of the most iconic NES games of the era. Super Mario Bros. 3 was the final game this legendary team would produce for the NES and Famicom as Nintendo prepped for a new system to replace the aging 8-bit machine. Development of a Zelda 3 for NES began sometime this year, but progress on the title was short-lived. As of this video's recording, a prototype version of Zelda 3 is not known to exist, despite rumors and hoax attempting to state otherwise. In 1989, Nintendo officially unveiled the successor to the Famicom, known as the Super Famicom. Nintendo's R&D 4 team, now known as Nintendo Entertainment Analysis and Development, or EAD, was hard at work for new software for the machine. A fourth Super Mario Bros. Game was the team's top priority, as it was intended to launch with the Super Famicom. But development for a third Zelda was also shifted to the Super Famicom. The team started small. Shigeru Miyamoto returned as producer for the title, while a team of 3 to 4 developers began crafting ideas for the upcoming release. The upgraded hardware of the Super Famicom gave Miyamoto and his team plenty of power to create many of the ideas they wished to implement in earlier releases, while some would remain on the cutting room floor. One of the first elements the team explored was a graphical showcase. In the original Legend of Zelda, Miyamoto stated he wished to showcase the water lowering in a dungeon in real time, as opposed to simply making the water vanish between screen transitions. In addition, diagonal movement was added to the release, giving Link a total of 8 directions to move in, as opposed to 4 from the first Legend of Zelda title. Zelda 3 was meant to be more than just an updated version of the original Zelda. Thanks to the rise in popularity of role-playing games after the release of Zelda 1, Nintendo EAD set out to utilize more role-playing elements in the game, although levels and experience points, a feature of Zelda 2, would be cut from the final release. Party members were also intended to make an appearance, with Miyamoto stating in a conversation with Yuji Naka, the creator of Dragon Quest, that he intended to create a party with an elf-like warrior, a magic user, and a woman, possibly one based on a fairy. Technical limitations held back the team's ambitions, however. One concept cut from the game was the use of Link's lantern to cause wildfires. Like in the original Legend of Zelda, the lantern can be used to burn down patches of grass, but the original idea was to allow the fire to spread across the map. This idea would eventually be realized in the Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventure for the Nintendo GameCube. Full production of the game didn't begin until 1990. The team expanded to more than 20 members, with Koji Kondo returning as composer and Takashi Tezuka coming onto the project as director. Kensuke Tanaba, the director of Super Mario Bros. 2, or Doki Doki Panic in Japan, penned the game's script. Like the first Zelda, Zelda 3 followed Link as he took up his blade to rescue Zelda from Aghanim, an evil priest. Upon rescuing the princess, Link is transported to an alternate version of Hyrule known as the Dark World. Aghanim's true intentions are revealed as he hopes to revive the evil demon King Ganon, so he may lay waste to Hyrule once again. Link's quest continues with a second act as he sets out to rescue the descendants of 7 mythical sages who once sealed Ganon away. Gameplay for the third entry returned to the overhead style of the original, with no side-scrolling stages present. Hyrule is drastically different from its NES counterpart, with distinct locales, towns inhabited by multiple NPCs, and more secrets to uncover than ever before. Items like the bow and arrow and boomerang returned with the third installment. New items also made their series debut. The hammer and hookshot quickly became series staples in later releases. Even Link's iconic spin slash makes its first appearance in this third entry. The Super Famicom launched in late 1990, and with it, Super Mario World, the other major project for Nintendo EAD. Afterwards, focus was put squarely on A Link to the Past. Development was completed in 1991. On November 21st, 1991, The Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods was released for the Super Famicom in Japan. The new title quickly made a splash in the region and gave Japanese gamers their biggest Super Famicom game of the year. Alongside praise from gamers, Famitsu gave the game a 39 out of 40, a near perfect score. Zelda had landed on the next generation of home consoles, and unlike with previous entries, international audiences wouldn't have to wait all that long for the return of Link, Zelda, and Ganon. The turnaround for localization during the early 90s was far faster than it was during the NES days. For the new Zelda game, minimal revisions were needed for it to be released in North America beyond translating the game's script and various text. Due to Nintendo of America's strict guidelines regarding religious imagery, The Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods would have many of its Christian and theistic themes altered. First came the name. International audiences received the game as A Link to the Past, a clever name utilizing series protagonist Link's name and the fact that the title was a prequel to the original release. Crosses and Christian imagery were removed and replaced. Aghanim's career choice received a revision as well. For North America and other territories, he was simply a wizard as opposed to a priest. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past hit the Super Nintendo on April 13th, 1992. A power release followed a few months later in September. A Link to the Past was an immediate critical and commercial success outside of Japan. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the game an 8.75 out of 10, while GamePro magazine awarded it with a perfect score of 5 out of 5. Sales were strong as well. A total of 4.6 million copies of the game were sold worldwide, making it the 7th best-selling Super Nintendo game of all time. A Link to the Past was later released under the Player's Choice line of the Super Nintendo and was bundled with certain SNES SKUs. A Link to the Past remained locked to the Super Nintendo for over a decade before it saw a re-release. In December of 2002, a Game Boy Advance port of A Link to the Past was released, bundled with an experimental multiplayer game, The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords. Developed by Flagship, a subsidiary of Capcom, the GBA re-release featured a few changes. The most notable difference between the handheld and console versions being the Super Nintendo's superior sound capabilities. Japan and PAL territories received the game a few months later, in March of 2003. The GBA version of A Link to the Past was a major success, especially since the handheld didn't receive an original Zelda outing until a few years later. The port received high praise from critics, with IGN giving it a 9.7 out of 10. A total of 2.8 million copies were sold on the Game Boy Advance, making it the 11th best-selling game for the system. A Link to the Past saw its next re-release on the Wii's Virtual Console, when it was re-released on January 22, 2007, just a few months after the Wii launched. The Wii U Virtual Console received the game on January 30, 2014, and a 3DS version was available on April 14, 2016, but only for new models of the 3DS line of systems. The game was featured on the Super Nintendo Classic when it released in late 2017, and is playable on the Nintendo Switch through Nintendo Switch Online's SNES app. Starting around 2012, rumblings of a remake of A Link to the Past for Nintendo's latest handheld, the 3DS, began after Shigeru Miyamoto mentioned his desire to showcase the game in 3D. A remake of the SNES Classic never came to be, but a spiritual successor was made in its place. Revealed and released in 2013, The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds serves as the latest spin on A Link to the Past. Its world design and characters are directly influenced by A Link to the Past, with the Dark World being rebranded as Lorule. Since its original release in 1991 and 1992, A Link to the Past has been considered by many to be one of the greatest games ever made. A Link to the Past continues to appear on lists of the best Super Nintendo games of all time. In 2018, A Link to the Past managed to eclipse its predecessor in Game Informer's top 300 games of all time list and claim the #1 spot. And despite the game's age, A Link to the Past placed 14th on a reader poll conducted during the same time period by Game Informer readers. Even former Nintendo of America president Reggie Fils-Aimé proudly states that A Link to the Past is his favorite game of all time. The influence A Link to the Past had on the Zelda series as a whole could not be understated. Future Zelda games would utilize many tropes and mechanics set up by A Link to the Past. The dual worlds, journey to save 7 sages, and various equipment and items were reused multiple times in the series, including the N64 follow-up, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The 2D games in the Zelda series would continue to use the same top-down viewpoint as A Link to the Past, although there's only been one released on a dedicated home console in the nearly 30 years since A Link to the Past release. Countless other games cite A Link to the Past among the titles that inspired their creation, including indie hits like Hyper Light Drifter and Oceanhorn. A Link to the Past reputation has only grown in recent years thanks to the growing popularity of speedrunning. A Link to the Past is one of the most popular games on speedrun.com. At the time of this video's production, there are over 1,800 active players for the game on speedrun.com, with over 7,000 runs submitted to the website over the years. The current world records are held by Q's and Zelna for the any percent record and the 100% world records respectively. The current record times are 1 hour, 23 minutes and 3 seconds for Q's, and 1 hour, 41 minutes and 18 seconds for Zelna. My own journey with A Link to the Past began in 2009. That summer, in anticipation of an upcoming family vacation, I bought a used copy of A Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance from my local GameStop. The grueling 10-hour journey to the Gulf of Mexico was made all the easier thanks to my adventures in Hyrule. When we returned home, I finished off the game, put it back in its case, and I haven't touched the game since. Nah, I'm just kidding. Upon completing A Link to the Past for the first time, I restarted my adventure and beat the game again in less than 24 hours. I'm obsessed with this game. I love the entire Legend of Zelda series, and I have fond memories with each title, but A Link to the Past is the game that made me love this franchise. I had so much fun exploring Hyrule, finding secrets, and decking Link out in the most powerful gear the game had to offer. I've returned to the adventure over the years, sometimes just to explore this version of Hyrule I know so well. Its map is ingrained into my memory, and with it, all the nostalgia the series has to offer. A Link to the Past is my second favorite game in this legendary series, and it's found a home in my top 10 games of all time since I played it first. I was actually upset when I first saw that Miyamoto wanted to remake this classic game. Not because I wanted Nintendo to focus on a new Zelda adventure, although that certainly played a part. I was upset because A Link to the Past never needed a remake. It's a game so well crafted, I could spend an entire video gushing over everything I love about this game. A Link to the Past is more than just another entry in the historic Zelda series. It proved that the Zelda series has staying power beyond the NES era. It laid the groundwork for the entire franchise for years to come, with every subsequent Zelda game taking something from A Link to the Past original design. It is and will likely remain one of the finest games ever crafted in this relatively young medium. If, for whatever reason, you've never played this legendary title, I implore you to do so. To me, there's nothing else quite like it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and share it on your favorite social media sites. In the comments below, I want to know your thoughts and memories on The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Subscribe to catch the next video as soon as it releases. In the next episode of the story of The Legend of Zelda, we'll move away from home consoles to Nintendo's Game Boy for the first handheld entry in the series, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening.